Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Yes, folks, hello and welcome back to the Spotlight. As you heard in the introduction there, Ross Tucker here from Cape Town, South Africa. I've returned home after a 2-month trip that took me via the UK to Spain, back to the UK, and now back to South Africa. So I'm finally home, as you can see from the background. And Gareth is, as always, in Wales. Morning, Gareth.
Morning. Yeah, I'm glad to see that picture back behind you, that mountain, whatever it is.
I'm less glad to have it back behind me, I'll be honest. So this Spotlight, as I always introduce it, is the show that's inspired by our community. It's where we try and engage with some of the things that you've been discussing and talking about over on Discourse, which is our sort of VIP platform. You become a member there by making a monthly pledge to the show. At Patreon, I'll put the link in the show notes, and then that gives you access to like-minded listeners who are sharing their thoughts around training and sports and news and everything else that we discuss on the show. In the last couple of weeks, what Gareth and I have realized is that this Spotlight show has become quite sometimes lengthy, but detailed, because there's so much substance to what's being discussed over on Discourse by our listeners. And so we've decided that we were going to split the Spotlight up. And so where we used to have a news feature, and then we used to go into some of the scientific topics and try and offer some insights into those discussion points over on Discourse, we're going to take those into 2 shows now. I think it might make navigation and your listening decisions a little bit easier. It'll be more digestible, as it were. So there will be a Spotlight news show, which is what this is. And then later in the week, there'll be a Spotlight science show where we pick 2 or 3, sometimes more, of the interesting topics over on Discourse and dive into those a little bit more. So that's going to be a new pattern. It means there'll be 2 shows a week, but shorter ones. We'll keep going with the timestamps in the show notes. If you want to skip, for instance, the marathon discussion and go straight to the doping discussion, whatever it is, you'll have the flexibility to do that. So hopefully it works. Let us know your feedback. As always, we try and take it all on board and deliver something that gives you the best chance to engage with the sports science. So it's a new show today.
Plus, of course.
Yes.
Plus, of course, the feature shows.
Yeah, so that, and then that's
Which
the other
should be.
intention, is that yes, you're quite right. So there'll be the 2 Spotlights a week, and then where possible, we'll get those feature shows. Those are the ones that take, I wouldn't say a little bit more effort and work. It's actually exponentially more, but where we try and get guests and so on. We've got a few interesting lined up for you before the end of the year. So hopefully we can get into that kind of cadence, and we can keep the conversation going in that way. Thanks for that reminder. Right. This is a news show. The news begins with a look back at the final marathon major of the weekend, which was held in New York. And I think on both the men's and women's side, we'll talk about where it fits in the year, but I reckon nearly as good as Tokyo's World Champ Marathons.
Yeah, because, of course, it's not paced. So you get real racing. And I think that's probably the major takeaway to take from the non-paced marathons, is they always tend to be a little bit more exciting. And that's how it turned out, didn't it? With the women's race, with a new course record from Hellen Obiri, who was the winner, and came down to was it the last mile? It was her and Sharon Lakidi, and it came down to what I thought was going to be a sprint finish. But there's a little uphill to the line, isn't there, in New York, which I wasn't really aware of. And I messaged you and said, hang on, where's this uphill come from? And you, yeah, it's always been there. You just never really noticed it. But and that's where she was just stronger in the end. But we both picked Lakidi earlier on, didn't we? She was looking the better runner. But it's impossible to tell with Obiri.
Yeah, Lakedi looks really fluid and smooth. Obiri never looks good, but she hasn't looked good winning multiple world and Olympic medals, but she's got some finish on her. So it's just that earlier this year in Boston, the same 2 athletes got to the final mile, and I think we were conditioned by that result, which was won by Lakedi, not Obiri. But Obiri was too good this time. I think Chepkirui was the other one, and I forget exactly where Chepkirui got split off from them, maybe just more than a mile from the finish. But it was a 3-person race for much of it, once they'd finally gotten rid of Sifan Hassan for good. We'll talk about her in a moment. But I think Chepkirui just did too much work too early. She was the defending champion, and maybe she felt that pressure a little bit. Maybe she felt solely responsible for trying to get rid of Hassan, and so she was the one who was doing all the pushing on the little hills that they encounter in the park, but also on the bridges. New York, I think, is quite interesting because, Boston and New York, neither has the pacer because there's no point, because you're not going to run 2:02 on those courses because of those hills. But
Well,
it
not
really,
as a woman, no.
The?
Not as a woman, no.
Well, you know what I mean. Or 2:14 even. I mean, that record was 20-something years. Well, no, we're not quite that old. How old was that record that Obiri broke this weekend? It was the last.
I'm not sure.
In fact, I reckon that record that fell to Obiri this weekend was probably the last of the records at a major marathon not run in super shoes. It was Margaret Akaya, and it was probably 2005-ish. If you just have a look but anyway, it was well before super shoes. So that probably brings every major record in a marathon now to a super shoe era. But anyway, the point is that the hills and the lack of the pace setter, I think, makes for an interesting race. And there was actually a topic of discussion on Discourse that was started by Gorbals Clooney, talking about major marathons and championship races and how they were much more entertaining. It's not universally shared. I mean, there is, and David Parkinson's posted overnight, that there is something quite compelling about watching a paced world record attempt. And that's true. I just think, from my perspective, if there were 6 marathons a year, I'd be happy with 1 paced world record attempt and 5 races.
It was interesting because the split, when it came, we'd seen Hassan sort of bouncing off the back a few times, hadn't we? Do you think they were intentionally trying to break her?
Yeah, I think so. I think Chep Kariri in particular was quite mindful that she wanted to test her early. And I think it is the way to go with Hassan, because she doesn't... Every marathon she's run, she looks like she's in danger of dropping off the front early. And I wonder whether athletes are either lulled into thinking you can get away with that, or if they know that maybe there's an opportunity where she is a little bit vulnerable in the first half. Because once you're in the final 5 or 6K, like we saw in Paris in the Olympic Games, she's not letting go then. And if you bring it to the finish, like 9 out of 10 times, she's winning it. So I think they were quite keen to test her and push. Remember, she'd run Sydney only 62, 63 days earlier than before New York. And actually in the commentary they were talking, I don't know if you heard this, but that previously the fastest turnaround to win a major marathon was in the 90-odd day range. So Hassan was taking another month off that. It was very ambitious to try and win a race in New York so soon after Sydney. So she would have been perceived as vulnerable, and I think they were definitely testing.
Just checking the records here. You were right that Katani held the record from 2018 to 22:48, but he only held it for a year because Jocelyn Jepkesai of Kenya, he took it with 2:22:38 the year later in 2019. So it hasn't been standing as long as we thought.
Really? Because in the commentary, in the commentary they were nattering on about the record being so old. Maybe I've been misled.
Hang on, no.
Yeah, actually, right. It's 2000.
I should have gone further back. 2003.
Yeah. 2003 was Margaret Akaya. I thought it wasn't Katani. Katani came close to it. She ran 2:24 a couple of times in 15 and 16, and 2:22:48. So she missed it by 17 seconds in 2018. But yeah, Margaret Akaya held that course record 22 years ago. Crazy.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's sort of Radcliffe-esque in the records.
Yeah, well, Radcliffe won it the year after Akaya, so it was the generation as well, and it lasted as long.
What was going on with that generation? And then the sudden big gap, a bit like the world record did.
Yeah.
It's odd.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so that was a 22-year-old record that fell at the weekend. So very, really impressive performance.
I missed that part. Actually, saying something about the commentary, they actually started using split screens. The moment you complained about it, they actually started using split screens in the coverage, and I was quite pleased about that. I knew it'd calm you down a little.
I can't have been the only one. I mean, I get that you want to show the wheelchair race a little bit, but there's not really any intrigue when the gaps between first, second, and third are 2 minutes each, and then you cut to the race, and all you're seeing is a guy freewheeling down a hill in the park. Split the screen. when it comes to the finish, by all means, and when there's actual tactical moves, maybe you can go back to full screen. But I don't know, some of the directorial decisions that are made in these races are beyond me. I mean, they cut to full screen interviews with the winners of the wheelchair race while the tactical stuff's happening in the park in the women's race. Crazy.
Indeed. So Hassan eventually dropped, didn't she, about mile 18? And we were left with the three women in the front.
And then she tailed off really dramatically, didn't she? Like she finished it. Those last 6 miles or 7 miles for Hassan must have been like 7 or 8 women ran it faster than her. She actually got passed through by Annie Frisbee, who finished just in front of her, and nearly Jess Warner-Judd, who finished 2 seconds behind her. So yeah, a little bit ambitious, I think, from Hassan on the day. Well, to try and do Sydney, New York like she did.
And on the men's side, we saw another. I mean, how often do you see a photo finish in a marathon? And we've seen 2
twice a year
in the last 2 big marathons. Marathons we've watched. Yeah,
twice
it's
in 3
incredible.
months. Yeah,
Because we saw Kipruto and Matuso. They separated themselves, didn't they, from the rest of the pack? Probably about 3-4 miles out, perhaps a little bit less than that. And then Kipruto, he'd been pushing the pace, but he couldn't quite separate himself from Matiso, could he? And he was looking over his shoulder all the time. It was like every couple of paces he'd be checking. And I thought, well, sooner or later, it's going to snap. The cord's going to snap. And it seemed to have done so in the last probably 200, 300 meters. And then out of nowhere, Matiso came roaring back, didn't he, to have this amazing photo finish by, I think it was like 0.03 of a second.
Same margin as the world champs. The only difference is that this time the comeback wasn't successful. Because am I remembering correctly that Sambu won the world champs coming from behind against Petros, and he beat him. But this time he was just held off Matiso, yeah?
Yeah, just held off. But and as you know, on Discourse, we've been sort of group reading the book by Alex Hutchinson, Endure, and we've got to the chapter on the central governor. And this was a prime example of the central governor. How did he manage to put in this sprint finish just to draw almost level when surely if he had it in his legs, he could have gone earlier?
Well, it's really interesting because like with a mile to go, you're right. So Kipruto was clearly the aggressor. And I think what helped him was he was probably just a little bit stronger because he was, every time there was a hill, you could see him make a little bit of an effort. And in the park, you spoke about that hill towards the finish line. It's sort of with 100 meters to go, they get to the top and then it's a flat finish down to the line. And that's the bit that Matiso managed to come back on him. So maybe he just didn't have any legs on the hills and he just didn't have it. And when he got onto the flat, he said, hang on, I can go for this still. But Kipruto was, we talk always about the pacing is spending a budget. By the time you're at the 41k mark of a marathon, your budget is almost depleted. It should be if you've managed it right. But Kipruto had made a call that he was going to spend what was left of that budget in those last kilometer and a half, let's call it a mile. Whereas Matiso, I don't think, made that decision. And he was just hanging into the last 100 and then spent a disproportionately large amount of his physiological reserve in the last 100 meters. And so the question is, why didn't he go 10 meters earlier? Because he would have won it.
Well, you'd have to think so.
So he was, the way he was catching up, he's going to get another 0.04 seconds if the race is 5 meters longer or if he goes 10 meters sooner. So you'll probably look back at it and say, maybe I mistimed that a little bit. But it's really interesting.
We'll never know. It was incredible one for the ages, really. Perhaps he just ran out of fuel. And talking of fueling,
sorry, I just wanted to make one other comment before we go into the fueling discussion. The one of the most interesting things about these non-paced races is the micro shifts in pace, and you don't see those on television. And I couldn't help thinking in New York, in both the women's race, because you asked, were they trying to drop Hassan? And I think they were. But you don't know. The best indicator that they were trying to drop Hassan is that there was a fifth person in this context, in the form of O'Keefe from the USA, and she was dropping off. So what was happening was the 3 Kenyan women were going clear. Hassan was dropping into 5th, and O'Keefe was finding herself in between them in 4th. And then she was catching up. Hassan was catching up. So you could tell based on O'Keefe almost as a barometer, what was happening out front between Obiri, Lekedi, and Chepkurui. But the same thing was happening in the men's race. When they come into Manhattan over the bridge onto First Avenue, that was where Albert Correa, who was the initial aggressor, and Hillary Bore of the USA, they were pushing. But it would have brought the race to life so much better had they shown us more nuanced, precise splits. And like we've almost joked about it, but when you watch track racing and they show you as they're running down the back straight in a 5,000, how fast everyone's going, and it's 22.3 kilometers per hour. So we don't need to know that. In the marathon, you actually do need to know that sort of stuff. And if the sport's going to become more consumable and engaging, I think they've got to figure out a little bit more how to show dynamic pace shifts in these races, because so much of how the race was won is lost through television coverage. Anyway, it's just a comment.
How much of a pace shift would they be putting in, the women, say, when at those 3 times when they sort of dropped Hassan? Is it just another couple of seconds off a K?
Probably 3 to 5 seconds in a 400 if you want to make a real shift off a slowish pace. If the pace is fast and they're running... It doesn't
sound a huge amount.
No, but again, remember, like they are running so close, not quite critical pace for them, critical speed, because that's their 1 hour speed, right? But they're running just below that. So if you take them 5 seconds per 400, you suddenly cross over that threshold, because it's so close to like the thin line between a sustainable and a non-sustainable pace. So if you shift it by 3 or 4 seconds per 100 at the 20k mark, that's seen or felt by the body as a pretty significant move. And you could see it because Hassan was losing 4 or 5 seconds every 500 or 600 meters. So Hassan was running one pace, and the others were varying at fast then slow, fast then slow. And you had to judge it with your eye, not numbers. And I reckon they could really unlock more value if they showed that. So.
Some of those bridges are quite steep as well. I was surprised by that. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before, and Hassan seemed to be struggling on those as well. And it seems to be that and Boston seem to be 2 races where if the stronger really suits the stronger runners. And I think at the end of the race, it was Obiri's strength at that final hill, which did for the
and one of the challenges if you decide you're going to show the pace is you have to adjust it for the gradient. So you'd have to be quite clever, because obviously you can be running 3 minutes 20 a k, and then you keep going at that pace, but it's perceived as a massive increase because you've suddenly gone up a 300 meter hill at 5% in the park, for instance. So.
Well, yeah. I started to mention Joe Klecker earlier on of the USA. He came in 10th in the 2:10:37, which is an excellent effort. And we'd concentrate on him because he'd said before the race that he was taking 170 grams of carbs per hour. And as you know, if you listen to this podcast, we're kind of obsessed with fueling and how many carbs you can get into yourself. And we'd seen this on Instagram, and during the race, we were sort of theorizing on how he was getting that much carbs down him, because in cycling, it's not so difficult, but in running, as you know, it's more difficult to get carbs in, because if you're taking it in liquid, it sloshes it around. So he actually revealed, didn't he, on a YouTube podcast with George Beamish. What was the name of the podcast? Because we do need to credit it.
Coffee Club.
It was the Coffee Club podcast.
Yeah, pretty good actually.
An interview with them. He revealed his methods and his training with carbs, because he's a bit of a carb disciple now, isn't he?
Yeah, so we're going to actually play a little bit of that into this podcast. It's about a 2-minute long discussion, and the context is it's co-hosted by Geordie Beamish, said athlete being world champion in the steeplechase from Tokyo, and they take a question from Ollie Hoare, who's another unsponsored athlete. So I think there's a theme here, and Ollie Horse talks to him about what your carb strategy is, and so he goes about explaining this. And this is where he reveals that in the course of the race, he takes 7 bottles, 500 ml each. So that's 3.5 liters. Have I got that? 400 mils each. Is that correct?
Yeah. 7 bottles of 400 ml on the course.
Yeah, so
50 to 55 grams of carbs in each bottle.
Yeah, so 2.8 liters of fluid over 2 hours 10. And when you're running at the speed that they're running, that's so much fluid to take on. And my initial thought was that he would probably try and hit that target with concentration, not volume, because that's the trade-off always. Is you can mix a drink up to like 20%, so that you've got 200. So per liter you'd have 200 grams of carbs, or you can dilute it down to say 10%, where you've got 100 grams of carbs in a liter of fluid. But the trade-off then is that you need more volume to get the same carb amount in. And the question was, and you then managed to do a bit of the detective work to find this excerpt. So I'm going to play that in for you. He's already spoken about what the strategy is. And now he's almost in this part that you're about to hear, justifying the need for it and talking about how their scientists and they don't reckon that 100 is even enough. So the next voice you'll hear is Joe Klecker, and the other voice you'll hear is Geordie Beamish asking him a question or two. Here it comes.
I've found that the fueling is incredibly important. And I think that it is going to be like people are going to realize in like 5 years, maybe 100 grams of carbs an hour is not that much. You know, you're seeing it with the cyclists. So why is it different for running?
Mm-hmm.
I know stomaching it is the hard part.
It's harder
running,
for runners, yeah.
but I think it's trainable. Like,
yeah,
I took the David Roach approach. I saw one time he said he would like chug a huge bottle, and then do his rep right away.
Yeah,
and so whenever I'd have a track workout, I'd do that. And Laura was like, "You're ridiculous for this. Like, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
And so like today, I just chug 50 grams of carbs in about 10 seconds, and then gone.
Now the bottles, I think, are a game changer because like I try, all of us now are pretty into the high carb lifestyle, whatever you want to call it. And like we have gels and the drink mixes, but with the drink mixes, you can really, you can go ham on it. And it would be like the one thing that we don't do, which it would be really good to do this at some point in our lives, is to actually get in a lab. And because you can do studies on how much your body is actually able to absorb.
Yeah.
That would be something that would be really interesting to see. But I'm sure it is, as you said, something that you can change and train over time.
So it's a bit, what we've seen with like the sports scientists is that like the more carbs you take in, the less efficiently you actually metabolize them. But if you're taking in, say, 100 grams of carbs and you're metabolizing 80% of them, that's 80 grams of carbs.
Mm-hmm.
If you're taking in 170 grams of carbs and you're metabolizing 60% of them, that's still more than 80. Is that more? It's more than 80 grams. But like, that's like how the theory works is
totally.
like, even though you're less efficiently metabolizing these carbs, the more you take in.
Which makes sense.
You're still getting in more carbs, and that's saving your glycogen stores, preventing you from switching over to more of a fat metabolism that is much more inefficient.
Yeah.
So we'll cut it there. I'll say I was quite so earlier on he'd also spoken about this idea that at the 20-mile mark, let's call it 35K, you run out of glycogen, you're depleted, and now you have to go to fat. That's not entirely physiologically accurate. But in general, considering that their job is not to be scientists, their job is to run fast, I was quite impressed by both his and Beamish's knowledge and thought about this issue. I found it quite an insightful interview. And actually, the Citius Instagram post posted a picture of him finishing, saying congratulations on the 210, and I posted underneath, all I want to know is, did you hit 175? And he replied, he said, I did. No details, but I think we know how he did it now. But I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I nearly spat up my coffee then when he says he chugs 50 grams of carbs in 10 seconds and then does a workout. That's quite impressive for like speed eating competitions, let alone marathon runners. So what concentrate is that if he's doing 400 ml bottles of 50 to 55 grams of carbs? What's that, 15%?
Let me just see. It's 55 divided by 4. Yeah, it's 14. Let's call it 14%. Round it up. It's about 14%.
That's pretty syrupy then.
It will be, but I mean, these days, and Beamish alludes to it, like these days, the mixtures that you can take allow you, because I've found in my own carb pursuits that I can get sort of 90 grams of powder into 600 ml bottle. So that's more. And it doesn't come across as too syrupy. It dissolves pretty well. I don't know what they do to it with its pectin or what the formula is.
It's the volume that's the problem. And he also mentions that the more carbs you take in, the less efficiently you metabolize them. That's true as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
They know this. It's just a case of cramming them in.
Yeah, we saw this, and we discussed a while back when we did our main carb discussion on a spotlight. We spoke about a paper that was published by a guy called Tim Podlegar, and that's what they did. They did, if memory serves me, 120 versus 90 grams. And sure enough, when you take 120, you oxidize, let's say, 76% of it. At 90 grams, you can get to 85% of it. But he's right. I mean, his maths wasn't quite precise at the end. Again, not a major problem. But 60% of 170 is 102. So in the end, you get slightly more, even if your oxidation fraction is slightly lower when you take more carbs in. But I think the thing is, like he speaks at the end there about how it's going to be enough to delay the depletion. The thing that I'd gotten stuck on for a long time until we had that interview with Jamie Whitfield on the pod is that when these athletes are finishing these races, they're not carb depleted. Like, so even without his 175, okay, I'm not saying you should go down to 10 grams an hour like some people may think, but if they were on the old model of saying 60 to 70 grams per hour, Joe Klecker would not finish in a hypoglycemic state where his brain is not seeing glucose. Maybe you could argue that the muscle glycogen levels would be really low, but you wouldn't be carb depleted in that sense that you would have to switch, as in that, towards carbohydrates, towards fat rather. And so instead, I think the mechanism by which the high carb is working, and Jamie mentioned this, is it makes us more efficient from the start. The cost of oxidizing carbs to get energy out is lower than of oxidizing fats. And so in effect, you get a super shoe-like benefit. But you just use less oxygen to run at the same speed of, in his case, 306s to 310s. He's running that in the equivalent of a super shoe because of the carbs, if that makes sense.
But he is, in a sense, carb deficient. If his body's saying, okay, now I've got to use fat, and that's going to slow you down.
But that's the thing, is the body's not...
He's carb deficient for the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you could look at it like that, yeah. I think that makes sense. Because again, and this sort of, it all ties back together. Like last week we spoke about or was it the week before? I can't even remember. About the central governor and Noakes's model that you can get away with 10 grams. Yeah, you could get away with 10 grams if your only objective was to survive. But a marathon's not meant to be a test of survival. It's meant to be a performance assessment or test. And then, of course, the demand goes up. The brain is monitoring what's available. It knows what's available. And if it has more carbs available, it uses them. So yeah, you're right. I think you could frame it like that and say, why would you want to use fat when carbs are possible and available to you? And the answer is you don't. You'd rather be oxidizing carbohydrates because it is just a more effective, efficient way of getting the energy that you need quickly.
Mm. And the other thing he mentions is that it's really been helping him out in his training. He's had a lot of pop, and recovery is better in training as well. And we know that as well, don't we? And that's been something that's been discussed on Discourse, that having enough carbs basically helps you recover, and it's overall. And the other thing I was going to mention is, why does Geordie Beamish need to take high carbs? Considering he's like a middle distance runner, the furthest he runs is 5,000 meters, isn't it? He doesn't need to take carbs in during a race.
That's racing, yeah. But I'm sure that you almost answered your own question when you set it up by talking about the training. Yeah. Because even as a steeplechase guy, like he would probably be running well over 100 kilometers a week when he's training. He may race short, but the training volumes will still be relatively high. And it's interesting, when the low-carb thing began, and we're going back 15 years now, there were studies that were coming out looking at the effect of low-carb versus high-carb on the risk of overtraining. And those studies definitely showed that when your carbohydrate intake was low, and that's not necessarily during training only, it's during and through the day. So, you talk about 12 grams per kilogram body weight of carbs per day to fuel high-volume, intense training. If you deny that to athletes, then they just overtrain quicker. Their mood states will get worse. Their training adaptation and responses deteriorate. And if you kept that going for a long time, their performance would fall off eventually. So that's why Beamish would be interested in it. It's clearly as you pointed out, an avenue that has allowed Klecker to train a little bit harder. So I think there's something to it. I don't know that 170 is necessary. I would be surprised if he couldn't get away with 120, 140.
But if you can tolerate it, why not have more? Because, as he said, there's a case of you can only metabolize a certain amount, so the more the better. Just gets you an extra percentage. And the marathons come down to percentages, don't they?
Yeah,
worked for him.
it's true. And I mean, I wonder whether the pendulum has now swung from 60 to 150, and it'll find a sort of equilibrium at some point where most elite athletes even are at 120. To emphasize this, I mean, like, there's no way that people who listen to this and are going to go out there and run 3-hour marathons, although many of our Discourse followers, there's a thread at the moment on predicting a marathon time, and these guys are talking 2:30s and so on. So that's pretty accomplished performances. I don't think most people listening to this need to bother and worry about 400 mils of fluid every 20 minutes or so that he would be taking at a 14% concentration.
But unless you're elite, you don't get the opportunity in a race anyway. If you're just a standard runner, you're not going to have your bottles ready, lined up with exactly the right carb mix, are you?
Yeah, but you could be. I mean, like,
so you've got to work on a different strategy.
Even a cyclist, I mean, it would be possible to take 2 bottles. As I say, I load each bottle with 90 grams. 2 of those is 180. You can take gels at 50. 4 of those is 200. So I could get 380 grams on the bike without too much hassle. And if I rode for 3 hours, I could be hitting 130 an hour. It wouldn't be good. It would not end well, I reckon. But I don't need it.
Yeah, that's fair enough on a bike, but it's not as easy in a marathon. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. But the point is, what I'm getting at is, I don't think people listening to this, unless you're in the 210 range, need to say that's my new target. I think everyone should experiment and see how high they can get there comfortably. But if you're at 90 at our sort of level, Gareth, you'll be okay.
Well, I don't need hardly anything at all. A couple of other things to note from the marathon. Kipchoge's last competitive race, probably. He came in 17th, I think, and announced that he's going to run marathons on all 7 continents in a new world tour. That was his big announcement afterwards. And I hate to point it out to you that this is already a thing. There's something called the World Marathon Challenge, where you run 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 continents. And that's been going on for years. I remember reading a book about it. Yeah. So it's not new, but hell of a career. Fair play to him. At least he finished.
Yeah, and
which was more than the other one. Bekele, he DNF'd around mile 17, didn't he? 43 years old. So he gave it a shot at that pace. But I guess some days it's just not your day, and you just think, that's a shame to end a career that way. But
when you get to your 40s and you've been running since 2003 was Bekele's first World Championship 22 years ago. So was Kipchoge's actually. It's happy trails.
I think it shows the competitive elements, the competitive nature of these runners, doesn't it? Because if you don't just keep jogging along to the end just because it's your last marathon. It's like, I gave it my shot and then I'm just going to drop out.
Yeah, whereas Kipchoge
must have done a few others.
A few?
Did you see that a world record for the highest number of finishes in a marathon? 59,226 finishes.
I saw that.
I'm not sure how many DNF'd overall, but it would have been over 60,000 for sure if everybody had got to the finish line.
I saw there was a video doing the rounds last night. The last person to finish was at about half past midnight on, it would have been Monday. It was a double amputee, I think from Venezuela. It took 15 hours and some minutes to finish it, and was welcomed home by some sort of committee in the darkness. Pretty impressive effort, actually.
I did read somewhere that there are over 200,000 people in the ballot each year now for the New York Marathon. So anybody wearing robot shoes in the future, I think, should be excluded.
Yeah, I think that's true, actually. They should not allow that. If you could do one of the major marathons, which would it be?
Boston. For the history and I think.
Watching New York on the weekend, I had this moment of saying, I want to do this one. But then I remember what it's like, because I've had people race it, and you got to get out to the start line on Staten Island, I think, and you stand there for about 4 or 5 hours before you even get to run.
Yeah.
So it's actually, even if you run a 3-hour marathon, you've actually been on your feet for 7 hours. Doesn't sound like
you just got to wait until Cape Town gets its marathon, and then you can stand up in gale force winds or not when they cancel it.
I think my marathon running days are...
Did we mention that before? Did we mention that?
No, that was...
Cape Town Marathon got cancelled, didn't it, due to high winds?
Yeah, they made the call.
And they're going for major status.
Yeah, literally overnight they made the call that it was too windy to proceed.
It was windy, I saw a video.
Yeah, they got a lot of blowback, pardon the pun, from that, because later in the day it really settled down as these things go. And then some videos were doing the rounds of how still it was and so on. But the Cape Town, because of the mountain, like you can find channels where the wind is blowing like at 7 million kilometers an hour, and then other places where it's absolutely wind still. So it was a tough call for those organizers to make. But they're going to. Then I heard they were trying to move that race to May, which in theory changes their win prognosis a little bit. So I don't know. Maybe they'll get away with their marathon ambitions. They were gold status marathon ambitions anyway.
Okay. Right. We'll continue with a bit of fueling, or under-fueling as it might turn out. There was an article in The Observer, which was pointed out by Sophie over on Discourse, about the Ozempic Olympics. As the World Anti-Doping Agency, it's collecting evidence of athletes using weight loss drugs for competitive advantage, and possibly could ban them before the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. It says there are fears that the LA Games could be remembered as the Ozempic Olympics, and that's gathered pace as an increasing number of athletes, particularly in endurance sports, have shown patterns of alarmingly rapid weight loss. Olivia Rabin, WADA's Senior Director of Science and Medicine, told The Observer that when other substances have been on the monitoring program in the past, they move from being monitored to being prohibited. It's because we've seen that their use is well beyond therapeutic reasons. According to Rabin, WADA would usually expect to collect evidence through its monitoring program for another year. He says, if in 26 and 27 we collect information that shows that weight loss drugs are being abused in sport, they could be banned before the LA Games. What do you make of this one? Because obviously we've talked about athletes underfueling with cases of things like Red S before, and athletes are obviously tempted in all sports. We've talked about cycling, but any sport, rock climbing, long distance running, where weight is a determinant, everybody's looking to get that little bit of an advantage by being slightly lighter, but it's not necessarily a healthy lifestyle. But is WADA right to be interfering in this?
First of all, I realized in reading the discussion on Discourse that I need to do a lot more reading on Ozempic and other drugs like it to understand exactly how they work and what they do. You know, those drugs were initially developed for the management and the treatment of people with diabetes because they contribute and assist with glucose regulation and control. So they aren't only weight loss drugs, and there might well be performance benefits beyond that WADA would be looking at and have a right to try and manage. But then you pointed out in the Discourse thread that there are, and this always comes up every time there's a discussion about should substance X be banned, is there are 3 criteria that WADA use, right? I don't know, did you read those right now? Was I daydreaming?
3 criteria is it has the potential to enhance sport performance. It represents an actual potential health risk to the athlete. It violates the spirit of sport.
Yeah, so I reckon depending on which side of this you fall initially, you could probably make a case for 2, if not 3 of those for Ozempic.
Mm-hmm. I said 2. I said the first 2.
Yeah.
Enhances sport performance, and it could represent a potential health risk to the athlete.
Yeah, and the third one is always the trickiest one. Like, who gets to decide what's against the spirit of the sport, right? But that's the case for all the drugs. It comes up all the time. The first one, to me, is the interesting one because literally last week we spoke about why exercise and crash dieting may not necessarily work is because the body knows what it has available to it, and when we deny the energy we need for exercise, we kick in what I called physiological austerity measures. In a sense, emergency budgets, where we start cutting back on inflammatory responses, reproductive function. And you alluded in your intro there to things like Red S. I can't see how most athletes whose training energy requirements in a week would be well above 10,000 calories, sometimes 20,000, would have a performance benefit from taking a drug that denies them energy intake. So that's the bit that I'm unclear about, is Ozempic either a short-term solution for weight loss that an athlete would use? Because it works via appetite suppression, I can't see it being the best way to lose a couple kilograms to make a weight category in a day or 2. Over a week or 2 and a month, I can see it. But now you've got the trade-off where you're actually not fueling the energy. And we've just had a 10-minute conversation about the importance of fueling energy in training fueling, training, and racing, and nutritionists have never been more in favor and in vogue in elite sport. And then you're going to say that an athlete's going to cut down on energy intake. And I looked up some studies, incidentally, where the ad libitum, so left alone to eat to appetite, energy intake on Ozempic is around 1,000 to 1,200 calories per day. Now, that's not going to be enough for an athlete, but maybe an elite athlete would have an appetite beyond what they should have. So maybe an elite athlete can do it, but then they wouldn't lose weight. So to me, it seems like a catch-22, that it can't be performance enhancing because of how it works.
Because Rabin, he says he cited examples of products that have been detected as being used by entire teams for reasons that were clearly not therapeutic. So it seems to be almost like a program, perhaps. And I reckon he's looking at cycling there when he says teams to keep the weight down.
Yeah, but again, like
we're sort of
again, how do you keep the power up?
It's a trade-off, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, at some point, like, think about how much in the last 2 years we've spoken about fuel requirements, energy for the work required, Graham close quote, the 150 grams an hour that we know that athletes are trying to get in on the bike, the importance they put on recovery, not only in the form of like carbs, but also the other fuel and so on. And then you say, well, actually, we're just going to deny your appetite. Maybe an elite athlete eats beyond appetite, and appetite isn't a factor for an elite athlete because of the exercise control. I don't know. That's what I got to look a little bit up. But I just can't get my mind around how it can be performance enhancing when it denies them a performance benefit that comes from fueling.
Yeah, because I mean, I said that on Discourse. I said perhaps the key to these is how it works, and I don't know. Are they just appetite suppressants? Because I was under the impression this is how they worked, but the article does say the big change with GLP-1, which is one of the drugs, is you can eat normally and you're going to lose weight. So that's a big change.
Well, eating normally as in my normal appetite, but you're not eating normally. Your calories are coming down. That's why they work. You eat less on them.
There's no magic. It's not a magic bullet. You're just eating less. Yeah.
Exactly. But maybe
it's one that we're going to need to look into in far more depth.
Yeah, and obviously the way that, and again, this is where I've got to look in a little bit more. Like they work by suppressing appetite, and one of the big challenges with obesity is that there's dysregulation of the appetite. I wonder whether maybe as someone who starts off at 72 kilograms doesn't have that dysregulation, and so the drug might suppress appetite, but not to the extremes that it would need to do to cause a person who's 125 kilograms to lose weight rapidly. So there might be some subtleties in it, but if you came to me and said, here's a solution for your athletes where they're going to eat way less to lose weight, I'd be, actually, you know what? That's not a viable solution. Because we've tried that. We know what happens when athletes starve themselves.
Yeah. In which case, is it WADA's remit to step in to protect athletes' health there? But surely it should be the governing body of each individual sport, like rock climbing have done. They brought in measures, didn't they, to combat extreme weight loss?
Yeah, but WADA's remit is if you do it via doping. So it would be, I think. If it's harmful, and if athletes if it's not performance enhancing, they won't do it.
No.
So it'll be moot. But if it is performance enhancing and there is risk of harm, which I think you can argue that there would be, then I think WADA would have the right to step in on it. But it's that first one that I'm just a little bit stuck on, and maybe need to do a little bit more work on understanding. Because as you mentioned, and I said as well, these drugs don't only have appetite suppressing effects; they also have glucose regulation effects, and so it might be that their use during exercise has some benefit that offsets the negative consequences of eating less.
There was something in the article about that. Rabin does go on to say, now there's a drug that's a combination of GLP-1 and myostatin inhibitor to prevent the loss of muscle mass. We heard that athletes, to prevent the loss of muscle mass, are also using anabolic steroids. So I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. We just don't know the details.
Yeah, and the
But,
combination
I
of
think that's one we're
drugs.
definitely going to follow up on.
The combination of drugs, that's the big thing I've always wondered about, is even like people just talk about asthma meds wouldn't do anything, but I had it on fairly good authority that if you combined asthma medications with a few other prescription meds, you could really potentiate their effects. And so I think it's right that WADA is looking at it. I just don't know enough about it yet to be definitive about whether there's actually something to look at from a performance perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, from one anti-doping story to another anti-doping story. Again, Sophie, she spotted another article that the German runner Laura Hottenrott, she's posted on Instagram that she's been tested, blood tested 7 times in 8 weeks by anti-doping authorities. And she's complaining that taking all this blood is going to be affecting her performance, and why basically is she being tested so much. She was tested 3 times in 1 week alone. And she says, I find frequent controls important and right, but I still wonder, do blood checks really need to be take several tubes of blood at such short intervals? For a marathon runner with low body weight, this is a large amount of blood, more than you usually lose over several months on average, and significantly more than a large blood count at the doctor. So Discourse got onto this one because she'd posted pictures of the blood samples, the vials that they use. And as it turns out, it doesn't look like the problem's quite as bad as Laura thinks, because we've got some experts in there. We've got Matthew, who's a pediatrician, and he's saying that these tubes, I think they were 29 mil they Discourse worked out was the most they were being taken at any one time. And so even from a small baby, 25 mil tends to be a negligible amount. So she doesn't really have to worry too much, we think.
No, that's what I thought. I mean, she talks about it being more than you would donate. And I mean, when you donate, it's a big bag. That's not even close.
That's 400 to 500 mil, that is, yeah.
So this is a little
because
bit...
blood donations have been brought up as well, because they can be problematic for athletes.
Yeah, and that's, again, this is one of the great things about Discourse. It's what started it as a discussion about whether the anti-doping blood requirement would be performance detrimental, ended up being a really cool practical discussion for people who do donate blood, and then whether I saw the latest this morning is whether it contributes to the development of anemia. So that's one of the reasons you should join Discourse, incidentally, not to get anemia but to understand about it. But I mean, like, I looked up these agencies, like I found the Athletics Integrity Unit's document on this, and they're pretty precise about how much blood is required. Because the one thing you must remember is it's not just one little tube, go and test it. They collect an A and a B sample. The A sample is initially tested. The B sample is then destroyed unless it needs to be tested as well to confirm a positive A sample. So they collect enough to be able to do all of that, and they store. Remember, like, there's now a requirement as of, I think, 2016 that anti-doping has to store all samples for 10 years so that they can go back in a decade and retrospectively test for new drugs. So there's a document, and in the appendix it talks about, depending on what you need that blood for, whether it's a whole blood or a plasma or a serum, it talks about how you need 2 samples, an A and a B. Each sample needs to be 3 milliliters in size, or volume rather. For serum, it needs to be 2 times 5. So they're pretty precise about what their minimum requirements are, and I just can't see them taking enough from an elite athlete to be detrimental to performance. I think the athlete in question might wonder why they're testing her so much.
That's exactly what I was going to say. She needs to be more worried about why she's been tested so much, because they only tend to do that if you're being targeted, surely, or if you're running a lot competitively and winning a lot, perhaps.
Yeah, but if you're out of competition, if you're out of competition, you're not racing, and you're being tested that often, it's because they're looking. And so I wonder whether this
biological passport has flagged something up, then you would basically get tested like this, I would guess.
That's one of the ways they identify who needs to be target tested. Yeah, exactly. So, but anyway, I think it's I think the performance threat to an elite athlete is trivial to the point of zero as a consequence of anti-doping withdrawals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll move on to doping again, because an age-old doping story. Victor Conte, whose name you might remember from a Balco scandal back in the early 2000s. He died yesterday at the age of 75 from, I think it was pancreatic cancer. And you just wanted to mention this because he leaves a bit of a legacy in terms of doping and anti-doping. So I was quite interested to see what you were going to come up with on this story to.
No, I was just going to say, like, Conti is a name you'd know because Marion Jones, Tim Montgomery, the baseball saga, Maguire and Sosa, Dwayne Chambers. And I think one of the big stories I remember when I was still just out of university and then it broke, I forget exactly which year, 2008, 2009. Remember there was an anonymous tip-off in the form of a syringe, literal tip-off, that was delivered to a laboratory and they tested it and they discovered an, at that point, never seen before steroid, and it was called the Clear, or THG, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That was Conti's contribution to the world of doping, and I reckon there are very few people in the world who made as big an impact. And he spent some time in jail as a consequence of that, I think 4-month prison term. And then when he came out, he became quite a vocal advocate, explaining how athletes get away with doping controls or positive tests when their doping control officers came to them. And it was just interesting. I mean, it's obviously sad to see that he's died, but it made me think that there are so many people in this world of anti-doping who know things that never get revealed. And I think Conti died with all those secrets also. Because even though he was ostensibly talking about how athletes, I used to see some of the things he was tweeting, and it was never clear and obvious what he was saying. Extremely cryptic, hinting, innuendo, implied allegations against XYZ, if only the truth would come out kind of thing. It's kind of like the language Wiggins used in his book. The truth will come out one day.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
And it's just it's this ubiquitous, weird language that these people use. Like, the people will one day discover, I've been thrown under the bus, the truth will come out. Well, you know it. You could tell it to us right now, and yet you're choosing to, like, keep your cards like this. Just tell the truth, man.
No, because if you do that, if you do come out and say it, then you become a nobody when everybody forgets about it 5 minutes later. You don't keep teasing it. Then you will drop from the public eye. It's a self-promotional sort of thing. I mean, you said he did go on to become an advocate for anti-doping, and I think he was highly involved with WADA, which isn't WADA, but it's WADA, wasn't it? The Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, which I think is heavily involved with boxing.
Yeah, that's the...
And I think Conte and boxing probably go together well, don't they, as two misfits in the world of sport.
Well, that's sort of the thing, is I saw the news of his death, and I thought, like, so much intellectual capital is now never going to be realized, I think. And maybe it's just, why should he tell me? Maybe I'm being I don't know, like, unfair there, but maybe he did. Maybe he told certain authorities everything, but it just doesn't feel to me like any of these converted anti-doping folk ever really come out and solve the problem they were once part of creating. And that was the first and last thought I had about Conti.
Yeah, I didn't realize how big that Marion Jones scandal was at the time. So it wasn't really into athletics around the turn of the century sort of thing. That was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a really good book. One of the authors was Mark Fanaru WADA. Ironically, his surname was WADA. And they wrote a book about it, detailing, and that was where I sort of got to know, quote-unquote, Conti. So it was a fairly good read. I don't know if that book's still in circulation. This is now 15, 20 years ago, I guess.
Okay. A non-anti-doping story. The Women's Cricket World Cup final happened last week, and India vanquished South Africa, possibly the greatest sporting nation in the world, apparently. And actually, after you said that last week, I was thinking about how could you work out who the greatest sporting nation in the world was? Could you weight all sporting events by sort of significance and then look at their results and find out who would be the best? It would turn out to be the USA probably, but actually I don't know, because they're very insular with their sports, aren't they? They've only got their own sport, so you wouldn't weight baseball and that as heavily. Athletics they'd be strong in, but would you do it by population? I've thrown this at you totally out of the blue now. How, as a scientist, and I'll put it on Discourse, how would you work out who is the greatest sporting nation? By number of participants?
It's not totally out of the blue, because after I chucked it out to end last week's show, I did think, because I don't really think that, by the way, I was just being facetious. But I gave it some, I thought about it myself after the show. I was thinking, I wonder who actually does have the claim to be the greatest sporting nation. And like, so when you know, when the Olympics comes around, and I'm sure we did, in fact, we definitely did it in Paris, you rework the medal tables and you work out gold medals and total medals won per 100,000 people.
GDP,
you can work it out as a function of GDP, and then it comes out differently because per population size, it's the Caribbean islands and New Zealand always perform really well relative to the population, and Australia, depending on the games. Per dollar, it's sometimes the Eastern European communist countries, and again the Caribbean nations. But then if you got to expand it beyond the Olympic Games, right? Because it's not just about Olympics, and winning a medal is probably going to piss someone off. Winning some of the medals in the smaller Olympic sports is not the same as winning a football World Cup, clearly. So
no, exactly. That's why we need some really convoluted.
So somehow you've got to understand like the size of the competitive market in which you're playing. And you got to, that would be, I think, the main criteria is how big is the competitive market?
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously, as I say, the Americans have got their sports, Ireland's got hurling and things like that, and every country's got its own little sport, like I guess.
There are metrics that do this, though. Like, so for instance, when we spoke to Omar Chaudhry from football, they've got a metric that analyzes the relative strength of every football league in the world. So, for instance, the Premiership and La Liga and Serie A, I suppose, Bundesliga would be among the top four. Don't know if that necessarily in that order. Whereas the South African PSL and the competition in Bolivia, for instance, might be considerably weaker. So they've obviously got metrics that do this, but whether those are applicable across different sports, like cricket, for instance, take cricket compared to rugby. More people play cricket by virtue of the fact that it's played on the Indian subcontinent, but fewer countries play it at a serious level. So which one has a bigger market? And then you add in like add in the Winter Olympic sports where you get Norway, for instance, that would be really, really well. But how many countries are viable competitors in snow and ice sports? So anyway, it's a pretty cool theoretical question, which I did actually think about after I dropped it in there last week myself.
Well, that's why I was glad India won, knock you off your pedestal a bit. But I found out actually that India won $4.48 million for winning the World Cup, which was higher than the Australian men's cricket team got 1.32 million. So that's a big difference.
Well,
but it does show that.
I saw a stat that the last placed team at this Women's World Cup would make more than the winner of the previous Women's World Cup. So that's the extent of the inflation in prize money in women's cricket. Now, it might be a bubble because of where this particular tournament was played in India and the TV rights and the number of sponsors who want to be associated. And to be fair, the knockout games were pretty well attended. That crowd was big in the final on Sunday, which was great to see as well. So it certainly seems as though women's cricket's on the up. Hopefully that momentum is sustainable when they go away from India.
Mm-hmm. Right, and finally,
speaking of awards,
I've had
and
my
winners,
gears ground overnight.
Yeah,
World Athletics have announced their Female Track Athlete of the Year finalists. This is a short list down from 5. So we did talk about this before. So it was Femke, Beatrice Chebet, Melissa Jefferson Wooden, Faith Kipyegon, and Sydney McLaughlin Levrone. They were the 5 people, and it's been whittled down to 2 by World Athletics, and they've chosen Sydney McLaughlin Levrone and Femke Bol. And I just, this is inexplicable to me. I cannot work out how the hell Beatrice Chebet is not in the final 2.
First of all, why nominate 5 and then trim it to 2 and then pick 1 out of 2? That seems like silly.
For the same reason that Conte drew out and Wiggins drew all
but
these
like
things.
even the Oscars and the Emmys and the Golden Globes and the Grammys don't do that. Just have 5 on your nominees and announce 1 of 5. Anyway, that's the first silly thing I thought. So the only thing I can think of is Chebet and Kipyegon don't make it because of the doubt and the uncertainty around Kenya. Is that fair? Do you think that World Athletics would do that?
Sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, but possibly, yes. And that would then leave only Melissa Jefferson Wooden and Sydney McLaughlin Levrone.
No, I can't understand why.
America. And if you had 2 Americans in, that's how Bol gets in. I don't know.
Yeah, like
but
I can't
Chebet not being in there is a travesty.
I mean, Jefferson Wooden, if it was up to me, it would be Jefferson Wooden and Chebet. And I know both of them have got certain question marks around issues not related necessarily to them, but in Jefferson Wooden's case, her coach, and in Chebet's case, Kenya. But, just if you only looked at performance, if you anonymized the performance, if that was such a thing was possible, those two wouldn't be in the top two.
I mean, they say they've got performances. They've got Ball, World and Diamond League 400 meters hurdles champion, and defeated in the 400 meter hurdles with the top 3 performances of the year. Now, you've got to remember that also undefeated in the 400 meter hurdles was Sydney. Melissa Jefferson Wooden, World 100 meter, 200 meter, and 4x100 meter champion, undefeated in the 100 meters with the top 5 performances of the year. And Beatrice Chebet, World 5,000 meter and 10,000 meter champion, World 5,000 meter record. You can't tell me the Ball's performances were outshone those two.
Yeah, and McLaughlin,
especially actually looking at it, Jefferson Wooden is probably more impressive than Chebet.
Well, that's why I thought, if you said to me after 5, Jefferson Wooden was winning it. So why I don't understand. I don't know. Is that?
I posted it on Discourse and let the.
Sorry, I was just. Is it not a public vote? Is it?
No, apparently not.
Because that could have explained it, but it's weird. I mean, but even the men's list, it's just when you're on, you're fine, But like Lyle's raced as much as McLaughlin and Levrone did, I suppose. So they obviously don't care if you don't hardly ever race. So anyway,
there we go. That was my and finally. Gears ground.
Yeah, I don't have an and finally to add to that. So that's it then. Thanks very much, folks. That's, as I said, that's a wrap on the news. The next spotlight will be a focus on the science, and there's a few really interesting topics to discuss that have been raised over on Discourse. These topics we've discussed today are also on Discourse, and as I said at the start of the show, you can become a member by clicking on the link in the show notes, and then that will give you access to that community where you can share your thoughts and correct the mistakes that we both made and tell us what else we should have mentioned and brought up. And the good stuff will make it into next week's show, which is when we will speak to you again about the news anyway. For now, though, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.